Okay. Can everyone see this? I just need one confirmation. Can people see this?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, awesome. All right, everyone. Well, I'm really grateful to be here and present on a topic that's near and dear to my heart. As it was introduced, moving from annoyed to impactful, working with the selfie generation. So all this entire presentation pulls from the generational research that's been conducted over the years. And it's a lot of information and it's a little bit hard to digest. So I created an acronym VISION. And each of these letters will take us through the key points of the generational research and hopefully make it digestible and easily stored in our brains. So I'll walk you through millennials' value systems and the values that they live by. I, for individuality, we'll talk about that particular piece to millennials and how individualism is really embodied by this generation. S stands for stress. So we're going to talk about the mental health issues that millennials struggle with, as well as the substance abuse. So those co-occurring issues. I stands for instability. We'll talk about the economic disadvantages. And O and N stands for owning discomfort and narrowing our expectations. And this section is how we as clinicians, as practitioners, as addiction specialists, how we as the helping professionals can use a generational model with our clients to increase treatment outcomes and feel like we're making a greater difference. Okay, so approval, whatever. What we've seen with millennials, and let me go ahead and define that age range because it gets confusing with Gen Zers. So millennials are anyone born 1980 to 1995. So that would be 27 to 42, 43 years old. So this entire presentation is talking about that age range in particular, the 27 to 43-year-olds. So what we see in the millennial generation is that there's been a rise in individualism. In past generations, Gen X and boomers, duty and responsibility were the more important values that were taught. And the duty and responsibility were more emphasized in those past generations over the individual wants and needs. Today, we're very driven by our individual needs and desires. And millennials were taught from a very young age to be independent and to be self-reliant. We were taught to always pursue happiness above all else. And we were taught to be different and to stand out. And all of those, what we were taught, really led to this emphasis on individualism. We also see that there was an emphasis for millennials on self-focus. Baby boomers pioneered the modern brand of self-focus, and millennials were taught as children to put themselves first. Some of the more common sense advice that we often hear that really began in the 80s and 90s when millennials were growing up is just be yourself, believe in yourself, express yourself, respect yourself, be honest with yourself. And what we can see in this common sense advice is it all ends in yourself. So that self-focused piece was really, really deeply ingrained in the millennial generation. We also see that there was a rise in independence within this generation. Just be yourself became the central ethos of parenting in the 80s and 90s. Studies show that parents in the 80s and 90s named independence and tolerance as the most important traits to teach their children. Millennials were taught from birth to be independent, open-minded, receptive, to stand out. We were even given unique names because that piece was so important. And parenting at that time believed that that was something that they wanted to instill in their children. What we also see, not only in, I'll go back to this, the decline in social approval, is sort of a disregard for social rules. And by disregarding social rules, we see the byproduct of that is the equality revolution. One of the upsides to individualistic attitudes is lessened prejudice and discrimination, which I think we all can say is a really beautiful thing. Because being different is good became the mantra in the 80s and 90s, it started to promote that diversity, equality, and acceptance. And millennials tend to be more accepting of sort of racial minorities and differences and cultural backgrounds, tend to embrace that a little bit more than Gen X and boomers did as they were going through development. And a lot of that, again, is rooted in this childhood messaging. And what's funny is the only group that millennials won't accept are those who are intolerant themselves. We see that decline in social rules is correlated with the rise of individualism. And there's a big emphasis for millennials on choosing happiness over societal rules, choosing personal choice over social standards. Millennials were really the first generation to carve their own path and begin to question the societal norms or the societal scripts that had been passed down from boomers to Gen Xers to this generation. We were the first to go, whoa, 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 let me question this and really assess, does this work for me? Does this work for my happiness, for my vision, for my, and as you can say, I'm emphasizing the my part because that individualism and that self-focus was highly instilled. In the 90s and early 2000s, movies even promoted this specific messaging. And that messaging is rebel against restrictive social rules, don't follow the rules if it jeopardizes your happiness, and always do what's right for yourself. Movies like that are Bend It Like Beckham, Princess Diaries, Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants. All of those movies in the early 2000s were really hitting that message home. And it left an imprint on the millennial generation. So one of the biggest parts of the generational research is the self-esteem movement. And this is a huge part of the way that millennials developed and what we're seeing today. It creates a lot of understanding of how millennials orient to the world and where it all began. So as we know, millennials were born into a world that celebrated the individual. The number of psychology/educational journals devoted to self-esteem alone doubled between 1970 and 1980. Journal articles on self-esteem increased another 52% during the 90s. Children's books promoted self-esteem. One of the two more popular books of I Am Lovable or Be a Winner. So the self-esteem movement came in hot and it came in full throttle. And millennials were the first generation to experience this movement. Gen X and boomers didn't really have any exposure to it throughout their development. In the 80s and 90s, not only were parents promoting self-esteem, but the education system rolled out a curriculum. Researchers and scholars truly believed that high self-esteem would lead to particular outcomes. And this is a really important piece to the research. So at the time, psychologists, parents, educators, all those systems believed that if they created a generation that had very high self-esteem, it would lead to the following outcomes: better grades, improved work performance, and better life and coping skills. And what happened was the education system was so concerned about preserving a child's self-esteem and keeping that environment positive that they pulled away from any sort of critical feedback or criticism or even correcting students' mistakes. So the mindset was keep children happy, keep them feeling really good about themselves, make sure they feel like $1,000,000. And that's the most important thing we can do for them because that will create the most powerful and successful generation we've seen yet. So when we look at self-esteem and we compare it across previous generations, what the research shows is that millennials' self-esteem is higher than 86% of boomers in these self-report studies. Millennials' self-esteem is higher than 63% of Gen Xers. And there was a study done in 2008 where they looked at college students in terms of self-esteem and those markers. And the majority of those college students landed a perfect self-esteem score, which shows that millennials have incredibly high self-esteem, which is contrary to some of the stereotypes that we're really struggling with that piece. The research would say we're not. We actually feel really good about ourselves. With the self-esteem curriculum, like I said before, teachers and educators didn't want to hurt their students' self-esteem. So it led to this nonstop recognition. We see that with trophies and ribbons, and it didn't matter if you got into 6th place, you still got a ribbon and trophy because we didn't want those children to feel less about themselves. Because of the nonstop recognition, it then led to grade inflation, and grade inflation was seen in the 80s and 90s, and this is when millennials were going through, lower school, middle school, high school, depending on where you fall in the millennial generation. The number of A students nearly doubled, and this was not due to improved performance or increased study time. So then the A's given doubled not because of actual performance, but purely because we wanted to make sure this generation felt good about themselves no matter what. What the byproduct of grade inflation, or the outcome of grade inflation, was that it led to academic boredom. And a question that I want to throw out to everyone is, why put in the extra effort to be in the top 5 or 10% when 1/3 of students are already receiving A's? Why show up? Why put in the effort? Why try when you're already getting the praise and validation and recognition by just, in some ways, existing? So this little guy, he's so cute. Unfortunately, he became a meme. And I think a meme making fun of the millennial generation for everyone got a trophy. So I had to include him in this presentation. So a part of the evaluation is, okay, was the self-esteem movement helpful or was it unhelpful? Did it lead to those original predicted outcomes? Those outcomes were better grades, improved work performance, decreased violence, less cheating, better life and emotional coping skills. And unfortunately, the self-esteem movement was wrong. Self-esteem does not lead to better grades. It doesn't lead to better work performance, decreased violence, less cheating, or better life and emotional coping skills. There is no correlation between feeling good about yourself and those particular markers. The self-esteem movement taught millennials that their achievements are less important than being just inherently wonderful, because that's what the self-esteem movement's sole purpose was, is to just create a generation that felt good. It pulled away from critical feedback, criticism, or anything that might have hurt a child's connection to self. Some other questions that I think are important for us to think about is, if you feel great about yourself, even when you've done the bare minimum, why do more? And I don't think millennial, children throughout academics had that question consciously or thought about it consciously, but subconsciously that was at play. Humans develop true self-esteem from behaving well, achieving accomplishments, and honing their talents. That's how we authentically build self-esteem. So the millennial generation created this pseudo self-esteem. It wasn't really earned. And what we really need is a happy medium. You're not a failure for 1 or 2 bad grades, but you're not a champion for not studying at all. What we see in the research is that self-control, or the ability to persevere, is a much better predictor of life outcomes than self-esteem alone. And what happened is millennials who have increased self-esteem built on the shaky foundation, this shaky pseudo foundation of self-esteem, ran into trouble later when they encountered the harsh realities of the real world, because the real world doesn't promote this self-esteem movement. The real world is harsh, and there's a lot of criticism and failure and feedback and areas to improve. And as we navigate this real world, millennials weren't prepared for that harsh reality. And sadly, what the self-esteem movement did is it left kids ill-prepared for the inevitable criticism, failures, and adversity that life brings us. So now we're going to get into the cultural embedded messages that millennials learn from birth all the way throughout their development. And this is another big piece to the research. So far in this presentation, we've gone over self-focus, individualism, the decline in social rules or social approval, which absolutely shaped millennials to be who they are. We've talked about the self-esteem movement and how that movement left an imprint and the outcomes of that movement. And now the other piece is this messaging that we learned. Dream big, kid, you can have it all. So what are some of these cultural embedded messages? Millennials heard, you can be anything you want to be, follow your dreams, never give up on yourself, you are uniquely special, and there are no limits. We also learned, and this might have been covertly, but the key to success is not hard work, performance, or tremendous effort, but instead it's purely believing in yourself. In the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, these were the specific cultural messages portrayed. And millennials became very conditioned to hearing these statements. We actually see that books use this phrasing 12 times more often than they did in the 1970s. So the literature that millennials were consuming, the media that millennials were consuming, were promoting these messages, which are outlined in those bullets. So the question is okay, what's the aftermath of those cultural embedded messages? What's the aftermath of just believe in yourself, shoot for the stars, follow your dreams, you are special, you're a snowflake? What's the aftermath of that? And what we see is that it led to a generation that had grand expectations, right? Failure was never an option because you could be anything you wanted to be. You could shoot for the stars and it would always land. So an interesting study was done in 2012. And I know that everyone in this presentation can't share out loud, but what I want you to do is think about the answer to the question I'm about to ask. So a study was done in 2012, and they asked high school students, how many of you expect to go to grad school? Okay, so they asked these high school students, what percentage of you believe that you're going to go to grad school? So I want you to think of that answer in your mind. Okay, and if you have that answer, what the results were is 58% of high school students expected to go to grad school no matter what. It was a no-brainer, they were going to go. 58% of high school students, and this is in 2012. How many of them actually went to grad school? So now I want you to think of that number. 9% actually went. So 58% believed they would for sure, and 9 of them actually went. Okay, and we're talking about these grand expectations or lofty ambition. They then asked the same students, how many of you believe that after you graduate from a 4-year college, how many of you believe that you'll work in a managerial position 2 years after graduation? So now I want you to think of that number. How many of you believe that you'd work in a managerial position after graduating college 2 years after graduation? The answer was 68% of those high school students believed, yeah, I'll get into a managerial position after college, easy peasy. Now I want you to think of how many actually achieve that. 20% actually were able to accomplish that. And that's actually a pretty good number. But the discrepancy between 68% and 20%, there's a large gap there. So millennials expect a lot. They believe, again, that they can achieve anything. You know, the world is their oyster. Millennials' overconfidence is sometimes tempered by the dawning realization that we don't always get what we want, and we can try really hard and it doesn't always lead to success, that failure is part of this journey that we go through. And failure is important throughout life. It builds resiliency, but we weren't prepared for failure. We weren't prepared for the obstacles and the barriers and the hustle or the grind. That was not taught to us. We also have really, really high expectations for career options. The most common dreams of millennials are acting, sports, music, screenwriting, content creation on social media, whether that's TikTok or Instagram. And it's hard to accept that defeat, that those professions are highly competitive. So we've got lofty ambition. We also see one of the effects is extending adolescence. We're postponing those adult roles. And there's a term, emerging adulthood. I prefer that over failure to launch, which I think failure to launch has a lot of shame underneath the surface of that statement. So we see emerging adulthood. Millennials are struggling to adapt and kind of adult, or as my clients always say, like, I don't want to adult today. Adulting is hard. Millennials struggle with the decision to pursue dreams, these big dreams, or cut their losses and go home. And choosing something seems like giving up on endless possibility. Remember, those cultural embedded messages were really, really impactful on us. And we believed that we could do anything and everything. And that's just not how the world works. We need to help millennials claim something, to hone in on their strengths, their weaknesses, to really assess what's tangible and feasible versus having them go on that, I can do anything train. Millennials don't want to settle for ordinary things. Millennials are not looking for a job, but instead they're looking for a calling that's going to be an expression of their identity. And what we see is extending adolescence has a big impact on relationships. 44% of millennials believe that marriage is obsolete. And by delaying adulthood or delaying that phase, it also has psychological impact and consequences. We find that by extending adolescence or postponing adult roles, we're seeing less responsibility, less organization, and more emotional dysregulation. Gen X and boomers fell into those roles. They embraced those roles as an adult. They didn't fight it. Whereas millennials in their own way are fighting it. They're trying to flip the paradigm. And although that might have benefit to it, it also has a cost. We also see that millennials are really the first generation to be hungry for fame. They live by inspirational stories. Millennials believe that they're going to obtain success quickly. 51% of millennials said that the most important goal was to, quote, become famous. 51%. And 81% of millennials believe that, quote, getting rich was important and valuable. And I believe social media plays a very big role in this. But Gen X and boomers didn't really have that as a goal. It wasn't in their peripheral, where it is for millennials. We also see that these cultural embedded messages has allowed for a generation that's more expressive. We believe that our thoughts and feelings matter, and we want to communicate those thoughts and feelings. So I would say, compared to Gen X and boomers, our self-expression is better. We've also learned to love ourselves first before others, which I think delays finding partnership And yes, it promotes that individualism and that self-focus, but it also has a cost, which is it increases loneliness and isolation. We also see as the outcome of self-focus, there's an appearance fixation. Millennials equate looking good with feeling good, and you do whatever it takes to feel good or happy. We've seen a rise in plastic surgery because of this mantra. If it makes you happy, you should do it. We see a rise in materialism as well. 82% of millennials believe it's important to be, quote, well off financially. 75% of millennials believed it's important to go to college only to, quote, make more money. 45% of boomers believed this statement in the 1970s. So again, 75% of millennials believe going to college is important to make more money, and only 45% of boomers believe that statement back in the 1970s. 45 compared to 75 is a big gap. And honestly, when we look at materialism and we break it down, materialism is the outcome of practical self-focus. You want more things for yourself. Jean Twenge, who is a fabulous generational researcher for Gen Z and millennials, I wanted to quote her here: when we are fiercely independent and self-sufficient, our disappointments loom large because we have nothing else to focus on. Okay, so now we get to the S of the VISION acronym, which stands for stress. So we're now entering into the mental health and the substance use disorders that are seen by the millennial generation, the 27 to 43-year-olds. So far we've gone through the values. We have looked at individualism, self-focus, the self-esteem movement, these cultural embedded messages, and now we can look at how all of that impacts the mental health and substance use we see within the generation. So stress, anxiety, depression, oh my, I happen to be from Kansas, so there needed to be a Wizard of Oz reference, of course. So we're seeing the dual diagnosis. Millennials experience really high levels of clinical depression. 1 in 5 millennials report experiencing depressive symptoms. Depression diagnoses have increased from 47% from 2013 to 2016. 47%. 30% of working millennials experience anxiety symptoms daily. So clinical anxiety has risen. 61% of college students suffer from daily anxiety symptoms. So depression's up, anxiety is up, and much greater than when we compare it to Gen X and boomers in the studies there. Not only are we depressed and anxious, but we're really, really stressed. Millennials struggle with the top 5 stressors. And there's been a lot of research on, well, why are millennials so freaking stressed? Well, here's what we're stressed about. 85% of millennials report they're stressed about money. 75% are stressed about work and work stability. 62% are stressed about family responsibilities. 65% about relationships, marriage, finding partnership, family planning. 59% about job security. And 35% with personal safety. So I mention this here because I think it's important for us to check in with our millennial clients around these topics, to be asking, what does your financial stress look like? How is work stressing you out? Is it the bureaucracy? Is it the company culture? Is it the red tape, right, that you're experiencing at work? Because that's plaguing a lot of millennials, 75%. Family, navigating dating, relationships, partnership. I mean, 65% of millennials are stressed out about that. And certainly the personal safety piece, which I think we've seen a lot over the last 2.5 years. And we see an increase in loneliness, isolation, and suicidality. You know, millennials are suffering from loneliness and isolation because there's less social connections face to face. Millennials are reporting that they're starving for affection and they crave these close relationships, but find that, you know, hiding behind a screen is a little bit easier. Now, this is nothing compared to the Gen Z population that's even more lonely, isolated, and stuck behind a screen. But millennials were the first generation to begin to report this, and we didn't hear much of this with Gen X or boomers. Substance use disorders. So millennials' drug of choice are opioids, and they're 23% more likely to die from an overdose compared to Gen X. Millennials who use opioids recreationally are 5 times more likely to suffer from addiction, and approximately 12% of millennials are struggling with opioid addiction as of now. Millennials have the highest rates of binge drinking compared to Gen X and boomers. And 90% of students believe that they can easily access stimulants from their peers. More than 10 million millennials are currently in need of addiction treatment, and that's roughly 3 to 5% of the US population. So a big part of also the aftermath is the economic disadvantages that millennials are experiencing. And as much as millennials have been stereotyped as big babies or big complainers, we actually see in the research that things are harder for millennials. The age distribution of wealth has changed significantly in the US. Between 1984 and 2011, the wealth of older adults increased by 37% when adjusted for inflation, while millennials' wealth fell by 44%. The essentials are astronomically more expensive: education, housing, daycare, healthcare, student loans. All of those things were not as pricey for Gen X and boomers in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. So we really are experiencing more challenges in this department. And there's been a lot of corporate downsizing, as well as a highly competitive market. It's harder to get into college, to get grad schools, to find jobs. And millennials are the most highly educated generation. 32% of millennials have a college degree, and 13% of them are unemployed. Now, this research was pre-pandemic, so I want to kind of point that out. I'm not sure what things look like now since 2020, but pre-pandemic, 32% have college degrees and 13% of them are unemployed, and the national unemployment average is 4%. So the supply of college graduates overexceeds the demand in the workforce, which leads to this intense competition. And a lot of millennials report in this research that they feel screwed no matter what they do. Hey, I got the college education, I did what I was supposed to, and now I don't have the ability to shoot for the stars. Nothing's handed to me. The world is tough, and it takes a lot of grit. And throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, that grit wasn't promoted. And that's leading to that depression, anxiety, and excessive stress. Expectations versus reality. What millennials were told would happen throughout life versus what life is actually like. I think this picture does a nice demonstration of that. In the world of individualism and consumer longing, millennials have been taught to expect more. Remember, millennials were taught from birth to follow their dreams, that they're unique snowflakes to shoot for the stars, there are no limits. And this messaging from childhood is not always attainable. And it's really leading to bitter disappointment and defeat. Those high expectations that millennials hold were really fostered by the childhood media consumption. And high media consumption is truly enough to shape a worldview of relentless excitement and glamour. And social media has obviously played a huge role in that. Media consumption promotes perfectionism as well, due to the constant ability to socially compare. So we're the first generation to really say WTF, like what you told me life was going to be like is not how it is, and I'm not prepared. So now I'm segueing into some of the beautiful things that this millennial generation has brought to the world. And one of the biggest pieces is the equality revolution. Millennials have created such a enormous change in attitudes towards the LGBTQA plus community. In less than 2 decades, those supporting gay and lesbian rights have become the majority. Over 2/3 of millennials in 2013 supported same-sex marriage, and that number's only risen. Millennials are really the first generation to promote equality and love and acceptance with this community. Not to say that Gen X and Boomers don't, but there's a massive shift in the attitudes, in the lens in which we view different groups of people. In comparison to past generations, they didn't have the same media exposure to this community, which that media exposure really allowed for the acceptance and open-minded attitudes. In comparison to Gen X and Boomers, millennials were more exposed to popular media that showed various minority groups. Millennials have become more accustomed to diversity in a variety of professions, workplaces, neighborhoods, marriage. We're seeing far more racial crossover now. And millennials are more comfortable with this crossover, whether it's dating or music. The perks of individualism is that millennials value culture diversity and universal acceptance. And again, all this research is compared to Gen X and Boomers. So of course, there's many people in those past generations that promoted this message as well, but we don't see it as generalized to the generation. And so millennials have caused a lot of kind of shaking the system with the LGBTQ plus community, with racial equality, with being able to look at privilege and really become an ally to these communities. We also see changes in attitudes towards women. Women now earn the majority of college degrees and almost half of all medical and law degrees, which is quite amazing, actually. Women are now the majority of accountants, financial managers, medical scientists, pharmacists, the majority. And there's been a major shift in gender roles and attitudes. Feminist attitudes have increased 87% since 1970s. And there's been a profound shift towards gender equality in just the language that we use. And millennials are the pioneers of this. Millennial women are more likely, there was an interesting study that was done where they looked at stereotypical male traits versus female traits. And some people might question this study altogether for other reasons, but I wanted to bring it because I think it fits nicely into this, that when they looked at those stereotypical male versus female personality traits of men, millennials were the first generation where the researchers weren't able to distinguish who the participant was. So millennial women are more likely to have personality traits of men. Again, I think we can all question some of the aspects of this study, but the way that they looked at it is these male traits are competitiveness, independence, self-reliance, ambition, forceful. So women, millennial women, tend to embody those characteristics more than Gen X and Boomers. And those traits were competitive, independent, self-reliant, ambitious, and forceful. And they're indistinguishable now across genders. So now we get back to my handy dandy acronym VISION. We've talked about the values of millennials: individualism, self-focus, decline in social rules or approval, the equality revolution. We've talked about individuality and the outcomes of that. We talked about the self-esteem movement and these culturally embedded messages. We've gone through the mental health disorders of millennials, as well as the substance use. That one was under S for stressed. And I, the instability, those economic disadvantages that millennials face. And now we're going to segue into O and N, owning discomfort and narrowing expectations. So this is what we can do as mental health or helping professionals to really use a generational model and help our millennial clients to thrive. I think it's very, very important for us to know this generational research because it allows us to use a different lens with our 27 to 43-year-olds. And if we're not bringing in the generational piece, I think we miss out clinically because it's very, very important to understand this. So, ways to increase treatment outcomes: become informed about the generational differences, which you can smile today because you've hopefully learned a lot from this presentation. Um, Understanding the generational differences, the personalities, the behaviors, the attitudes, the beliefs, and values of millennials. We want to help millennials learn self-control and self-discipline skills. This is to help counteract sort of the self-esteem movement and some of those cultural embedded messages. And what we see is that self-control and self-discipline is highly correlated with productivity, performance, and even emotional regulation. So teaching our millennials those skills is important. We want to teach millennials practical life skills. So a lot of millennials, and this might have been when they were earlier in their 20s or early 30s, some of them don't know how to do laundry. A lot of them don't know how to budget or keep a track their finances, when to pay taxes, how taxes work, time management, maybe even writing cover letters and resumes. I mean, I've worked with people in their late 20s and early 30s that are like, I feel really silly to admit this, but I have no idea how to pay my taxes and I don't know how to write a proper cover letter or resume. So I think we need to be checking in with our millennial clients on those practical life skills. Are you struggling in any way? Do you need support here? We need to teach millennials how to adapt and cope effectively with life challenges. This generation struggles with the grit, right? Learning how to get on their surfboards and ride the wave and get through whatever obstacle comes their way. We don't really have those good coping skills to deal with life adversity. So, as clinicians or as helping professionals, we need to help them learn how to effectively deal with life challenges. And we can do this by building self awareness, helping them with decision making, problem solving, critical thinking, learning effective communication skills, and more importantly, the stress and emotional coping skills. And we'll talk a little bit more about the modalities that you can use for that. But yeah, check in with your millennials about practical life skills. Really help them to learn the adaptive coping mechanisms when they face adversity. Help them develop self control and self discipline. And we need to encourage millennials to foster face to face social relationships. So, with my clients, I'm telling them, I want you to go to meetup groups. I want you to join clubs, sports leagues, volunteering. Like, we can hide behind a screen all day, but the way that we create really meaningful connection and fulfillment in life is through close relationships. And that's actually a predictor for life longevity. So, if my clients say that, yeah, I haven't seen my friends in a while, or I just feel a little isolated or lonely, I'm really encouraging face to face interactions. A lot of millennials need support in the career department. And so we can help them navigate career counseling, help them identify their strengths and weaknesses. We do not live in a world where shoot for the stars, everything's handed to you, things will just land in your lap, the world is your oyster. That works for some, but it doesn't work for the majority. So helping millennials hone in on their talents and create acceptance around their areas of weakness and that it's okay. I mean, for me personally, I was never going to be an accountant or a mathematician or scientist because I suck at math. My brain just does not know how to even, that just doesn't click. And so that's okay. Let's help millennials find what they're good at. Oops. We need to help millennials cultivate realistic life expectations because what we were taught in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s wasn't realistic. So helping them explore what's realistic for your work career, for dating and finding partnership, interpersonally with friends, family, and with yourself. I had a client, such a special woman. really enjoyed working with her. And she was really struggling with work. And she had just started at a new company. She had been there for a year, and she had a meeting with her boss on Friday, and we were meeting on a Monday. She said, "Okay, Paulina, I really want to ask for a raise. I've been there for a year." And I was like, "Awesome. How can I support you? How can I help you work through this?" And she said, "I think I'm going to ask for a 15% raise." And I looked at her and I smiled, because obviously 1 year at a company asking for a 15% raise is not really realistic. And we had that conversation, and she felt bummed and felt like, "Well, I deserve 15% and I've worked hard." And we ended up looking up what's the typical raise given within a year within her industry. And it was a 3 to 4% raise was what was typically given. So sometimes we have to have the hard conversations of what's realistic and what's not, and allowing millennials to cope with that their dreams are not always obtainable, and that's okay. That's okay. That's how this world works. So creating a lot of acceptance. The other piece is helping millennials decrease overexposure to social media and TV. Lots of research are saying that high social media consumption is leading to higher levels of anxiety, depression, stress. So checking in intentionally with your millennial clients, how much are you on a screen? I know Apple will record this and you can look at your data over the week, but helping them decrease screen time by 20 to 30%, maybe even 2 to 3 hours less per day, and filling that time with meaningful hobbies, passions, social connection. So I always check in on a weekly basis, like, "Hey, what's your media exposure looking like?" So these are some of the anecdotal therapeutic modalities that I use with my millennials. This is not mentioned in the research, which is why I want to say anecdotal. I use a lot of acceptance commitment therapy. I'm helping my clients really cultivate acceptance of what they expected is not how the world is, and finding more peace in that. Looking at their cognitive fusion, what stories or narratives are they attached to, and how can they release those narratives and unhelpful thoughts. Really using a lot of mindfulness, being present, finding the beauty and richness in the present moment. Values, I'm helping clients identify what matters to you. What do you stand for? What makes you feel alive? And how can you live by those values, whether it's health or family or relationships? Like, what matters to you and how can you take committed action on it? I also use a lot of dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, really helping clients to explore interpersonal effectiveness. That distress tolerance and emotional regulation piece is huge, because millennials have pretty poor coping skills. Again, the self-esteem movement did not prepare us for that. So really looking at regulating the nervous system and having tools at their fingertips to, turn on their parasympathetic response and get more grounded when they face challenges. And in terms of the addiction piece, I use a lot of motivational interviewing. If a client's goal is abstinence or relapse prevention, some of the programs that I'll promote are 12-step, Life Ring, Smart Recovery, SOS, Women for Sobriety. These are great groups that help individuals work a program. I also work with clients that don't want to practice abstinence, but they want to do harm reduction. So I use the harm reduction model, and we really identify how we can reduce the consequences of use. And so I find that these three things help my millennial clients a lot. So I finished 5 minutes early, which is kind of nice for everyone. I am here as a resource. And I want to answer any questions, whether you have to scoot, no worries. You can send me an email. I'm providing services in both Colorado and Illinois. I'm dually licensed, and I'm always happy to be a resource. So if you ever want to consult on a millennial case, or you want to talk more about the research or anything that stood out in the presentation, feel free to text my cell or email me. I'm here, and I love having these discussions because they're exciting to me. So that is that. I also have the sources too of all, oops, there we go. Actually, let's do this. Why is this not turning? So here are all the different research that was included in this. If it matters to you, we can certainly send you all of the literature that was included in this presentation. But my hope is that this was helpful and it allows you to view millennials through a different lens.
Thank you so much, Paulina. That was fantastic. As a millennial, that was super interesting for me to watch and kind of get a little bit of an explanation of some behaviors that I see in myself and my friend group. I do have a couple questions right now. Someone would like to know if the PowerPoint will be emailed to participants. Are you comfortable sending me a PDF version that I can send out with their certificates?
Yeah, I'm happy to send it out. What I would kindly ask is that it's not distributed, that it's just for your personal use. Of course, if you want to share it with a colleague, not the end of the world. I just would like to keep it more for the people that attended.
Perfect. And do you have a harm reduction model available? Someone else asked.
Yeah, so there's the HAMS model. Gosh, where's my HAMS book? Oh, I put it back on my bookshelf. Yeah, I can, if that person wants to email me, the HAMS harm reduction model is wonderful for alcohol use. And I think it can also extend to other drugs. But yeah, I use that and I'm finding really good success with it. It's evidence-based. It has a lot of research behind it. So yeah, if that person wants to message me even on this, I can send them the book link.
Perfect. Their comment is as an anonymous attendee. So if that person, if you want to type in the chat box, we could get that to you.
Yeah.
If any other questions, please type them into the Q&A. While we're waiting for that, I do have one. So this could just be me being a millennial and getting older and one of those old curmudgeons who thinks their generation is better than the one that comes after it. But how do you compare millennials to Gen Z in this aspect? Anecdotally, I would say I see a lot of the same behaviors that we have as millennials in Gen Z, but to me, it just appears that they're amplified quite a bit. Do you find that to be the case, or am I just completely biased here?
No, I mean, it's a great question. I would say that, a lot of the research is still coming out for Gen Z because a lot of them are, at this point between the ages of 13 and now, 26. But yeah, we see some overlap for sure, like the mental health and substance abuse piece. Gen Zers' mental health is even worse than ours. And the suicidality and the cyberbullying and these school shootings, which is not something that millennials had to encounter as frequently. Of course, Columbine was one of the more memorable ones that the millennial generation would have experienced. But yeah, the rise in mental health symptoms. What's interesting is that Gen Z has the lowest rates of substance abuse out of all generations. So Gen Zers are not using as much. Now, granted, we all work in the treatment industry, so we're seeing a bunch of Gen Zers. So everyone might be like, what do you mean? All my clients are Gen Zers. But if you look at the generational research of millennials, Gen X, and boomers, the rates are actually lower than previous generations. They haven't been as experimental or really using as many substances in their high school years. So that's really interesting. But yeah, there's definitely differences in values. And we do, I've been asked to have a whole separate presentation of like talking about Gen Z versus millennials. What's the difference? So that's something I could definitely get more into.
Excellent, thank you. And I had, guys, feel free to ask some questions. I do have another one. You mentioned working with a young lady who thought she was going to get a 15% raise after her first year at work, and you were able to kind of break through and show her what was more realistic in a clinical setting. How do you suggest those of us who are not clinicians sort of approach these topics when we encounter them? We don't have, an hour or 90 minutes one-on-one with in a therapeutic environment, is there any tips that you would recommend for us to kind of effectively broach these topics with folks?
That's such a beautiful question. Give me a scenario and when you would want to apply it so that I can see it more in practicality.
Well, I think I'll just use the one that you offered. If
Oh,
someone sitting in an office with someone and they asked for a 15% raise in their first year, how would you go about sort of delicately broaching that topic without being dismissive and sort of writing them off as you're inexperienced, you don't know what you're talking about?
right, right, of course. I would start with really like a validation statement first, something like, oh, I totally understand like that desire. I too have like believed that like getting a raise in that percentage is what I need and deserve. What's interesting though, and then kind of go into what we actually see is X percentage within a first year. And I wonder, like, I want you to be as successful as possible. Like perhaps maybe lowering that expectation might actually set you up for a conversation that's going to feel really good with your boss. So I would kind of do the sandwich of be like, oh yeah, I get it. 15%, dude, I work really hard too. Like I would love a 15% raise, like kind of like bringing in a little bit of humor to soften it and then segue into what's really tough is that like 3 to 4% is really the typical raise. I'm wondering if maybe that might get you where you need to go. So I find that millennials need a lot of praise. They need a lot of validation because they receive that nonstop recognition throughout their entire academic career. So that's how I would soften it. But also, it's okay to be direct. Like when I smiled at her, she was like, "Why are you smiling?" And I was like, "Oh, girlfriend, like, let's talk about this because I don't know how realistic that is." And she was like, "Oh, okay, fine." And then she walked into her, that meeting and got the raise, which she felt so good about. So I don't know. Did that answer your question of like how to play with it?
Yeah, no, I think that's good advice. So validation, use humor to kind of diffuse the tension a little bit and be empathetic.
Yeah. And then also be real of like, hey, this is what like the numbers say. And I want you to be successful here. I want you to feel awesome. And I don't want you to walk into that meeting and have your boss laugh.
Yeah.
Because Gen Xers and boomers are still tend to be in those positions where they're like, are you out of your mind? I can't believe you would ask me that.
I don't see any more questions. I just have one final one. Can you send me the picture of that kid with the mullet and the trophy? I want to make that my phone background.
Oh my god, when I saw that meme I was like, I have to use that guy with the mullet because he's hilarious.
I had to double check to make sure I was muted because I was cracking up.
That's awesome. Anything else? I know we still have a little time if anything's coming to mind.